Hey guys, in this video we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the Sony RX10 Mark IV because it seems to look like a really dope camera. But is it? There's a lot of controversy going on right now in two very specific areas with the RX10 Mark IV. And that is, on the first hand, how does it compare to the Mark III? And on the other, it's the sensor size and an equivalence. Why I would never buy a 1-inch type sensor, that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot to get in with both of those, but I want to focus on the second first, on the sensor size and equivalence. The 1-inch type sensor introduced and propagated by Sony, seen in their entire RX series except for the RX1R, has a 2.7 times crop to full frame. It measures 15.86 millimeters along the diagonal and 13.2 by 8.8 millimeters, length and width and all that. With the total area of 116 millimeters squared, it's approximately 1/2 the size of a Micro Four Thirds sensor. Now we've seen excellent results out of Micro Four Thirds sensors from companies like Panasonic and Olympus. Going back to the actual sensor specs though, it's got a 2.7x crop with approximately 7.4 times less total area than a full frame sensor. So what's important here is not to think of that 7.4 times. You'll be able to find that number on the internet, that's why I'm quoting it to you. What we need to pay attention to is the diagonal of the sensor, because that's important not only for the crop factor, but also for understanding how the lens works in relation to the sensor. Smash that like button for the accuracy and the technical specificity of this deep dive here. I'd actually really love to hit 150 likes on a video. That's never happened for me before. That would mean a whole bunch if y'all would help me hit that personal landmark. So yeah, I think that would be really cool. Thanks for helping me in advance. But we shouldn't only compare to full frame. We should also compare to what else exists in its category, which is point and shoots. And now point and shoots the typical point and shoot sensors are much smaller actually than the RX10's 1-inch type sensor. Point and shoots have a crop factor from full frame of 4.6 to 5.6. There's a lot of different types of sensors in there, but it's a much bigger crop from full frame than the 1-inch type sensor. So with a total sensor area of 28 to 43 or so millimeters squared, the 1-inch type sensor way, way, way bigger than other point and shoots and camcorders as well. The sensors in these point and shoots are 24 to 37% the sensor size as the 1-inch type. And that percentage difference is approximately the same as the difference from APS-C to that 1-inch type. But here's the problem. We keep seeing comparisons in terms of the aperture of its 24 to 600 f2.4 to f4 lens in comparison to full frame. And those comparisons are not what they should be. But what's ignored and of much greater importance than depth of field equivalence is light gathering equivalence, because depth of field equivalence and light gathering equivalence are not the same. Those comparisons are saying the equivalent depth of field is approximately f10 to f11, which is the same as the kit telephoto zooms for APS-C point and shoot for APS-C cameras. So for the people that are shooting APS-C cameras with a 55 to 210 or whatever, you're not going to actually get a different aperture depth of field in comparison to full frame as you would on the RX10. So the RX10 and an APS-C camera, in terms of aperture depth of field, are the same in comparison to full frame. RX10 Mark IV's f2.8 to 4 lens is actually an f2.4 to 4 lens. Aperture relates to the ratio between the focal length and the size of the pupil, the entrance pupil for light. So at 600 millimeters at f4, you're still gathering equivalent light relative to the sensor size as any f4 lens on a full frame body. So when we start to consider that in relation back to the sensor, how it's a backside illuminated stack CMOS sensor with front end LSI, it really can perform well in low light. It really does have incredibly fast readout speeds. And that's even before we start thinking about the fact that the RX10 has the image processor from the A9, which makes everything a little bit more incredible. I feel like this brief conversation, as well as my last video, kind of culminate in saying that the RX10 Mark IV is a superb device when considered alone. So let's compare it to the Mark III. At first blush, this comparison is really important for a lot of people because the price difference, the cost difference, at around $400 is not insubstantial. The feature difference, also not insubstantial. The differences in features are contrast detect AF versus phase detect AF with 315 autofocus points on sensor, hybrid on sensor, phase detect autofocus points, 14 FPS to 24 FPS, which is cool. It's a nifty feature, but it's not functionally important for most shooting scenarios. And then S-Log2 to S-Log3. So what's the big deal? What's the price hike for? So while the sum of any camera is going to be the way that the sensor, the processor, and the lens all work together, in my opinion, AF, autofocus, is just as important for the shooting experience and the performance of the camera. The AF performance between the two is night and day. On the Mark IV, that's going to increase the value of every single specification and feature in the camera. The S-Log3 and the 24 FPS, not game-changing by comparison to the on-sensor PDAF. The RX10 Mark IV is now in a class of its own because of that on-sensor PDAF. Now, the easy comparison would be to the RX100 Mark V, but the lens is not remotely equivalent. The RX100 series has a 24-70 equivalent. The RX10 has 24-600, so I don't feel like those are comparable. So ultimately, the Mark IV compares very favorably to the Mark III, such that the Mark IV can be very easily called a worthy successor to and an admirable upgrade from the Mark III, where everything works how it should. It just works. The better, the night and day better autofocus performance, nailing stills and achieving critical focus in video is so important. The difference in autofocus systems is like the difference between rotary phones and dial pad phones. It's like the difference between floppy disks and USB flash media, or hard disk drives and SSDs. Once you switch, it's going to be really hard to go back. But ultimately, I'm really interested in your opinion on this comparison between the Mark III and the Mark IV, because my bias is towards really good autofocus, obviously. My bias is not against the sensor, I think, and the way that sensor combines with the lens, because I think that this is a fantastic all-in-one package. So I'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one.